Today we're talking about the very power of religion in role-play games, and the direction I come to it is kind of a backspin. As I've related many times, I've been a role-playing game master for 50 years. I started it as pretty much as soon as the game came into existence, maybe a little bit before, because my first storyteller, first game master, first dungeon master was Dave Arneson, one of the co-designers of D&D when I was 11, long time ago. And the interesting thing at that point in time was that the theme of the game seemed to be very, very focused on a monotheistic viewpoint. The very first adventures that we ran in, there were no references to any deity's name, and the concept of the cleric was very Western European. The concept of a religious person whose job either was to write religious texts or copy illuminations of ancient texts and such. And so it wasn't so much focused on the actual names of the gods. Now, within a short period of time, of course, the pantheon opened up widely when they added the book Gods, Demigods, and Heroes, from which I drew my title today. And they focused differently. But let's talk a little bit about what the idea of religion is in within a role-play game. Now, in today's version, it's been completely diluted. There is no longer the focus on the deity that a cleric or paladin serves. As a matter of fact, it's pretty much whitewashed into virtual non-existence, and that has everything to do with the redefining of the game in terms of our culture as a people. And we are so fearful of threatening another person's belief structure that we isolate them from one another and separate them in terms of impact. And when we look at the legacy, the history of the game, fundamentally it was sort of iconography. The creation of the Gods, Demigods, and Heroes book was specifically to cover what would happen if you met those beings in the framework of a game. Since you were in a fantasy setting, why not take that fantasy to the logical extent and meet with the creators, the beings that had been instrumental in the history of the world, and perceive of them as something that could be defeated. It was known that overthrowing of gods is that absolutely a ultimate course for many adventurers to face the powers that created the world and challenge them, even bringing them down if possible. And so what the Gods, Demigods, and Heroes book fundamentally was doing was establishing the numerical values for the different ideological identifiable pieces. So, for example, if you wanted to enter the world of the, if you wanted to enter the underworld, for example, and say rescue a spirit from beyond the grave, you had to have the defenders of that realm defined. And so certainly we have creatures like the Hellhound and Nightmares and such that are beings from those realms, yet you didn't have a clearly defined BBEG, if you will. They didn't think those ways in the original concepts of role-play games. Those tropes became evident by the processes that play incurred. But the very concept of deity in role-play games is in defiance of deity as defined, because for example, in terms of religiosity, in the religions of the past, even saying the name of a deity would potentially draw down the wrath of that being, because you were so you could almost say it was a Chris Rock of the universe. Don't get the words of my deity out your mouth. The quote from Will Smith is now classic for that reason. But historically, the idea of deity was the source of power. A cleric or a paladin would wear the banner, wear the emblem of that particular faith, and then would act in defense of that faith to the final degree, to the point of entering one of the classic images from, I believe it was the DM's Guide, may have even been a later book, but I believe it was the DM's Guide, shows a paladin literally crossing over into the realm of the abyss to face uncounted demons right where they lived. And that's a level of hubris, to think that your individual character could be in the presence of those beings that were at the godly level. With that in mind, I have to mention the fact that in Dungeons and Dragons, many of the spell effects, especially for those of the clerical basis, are listed as ritual. And the concept of religion and ritual predates modern awareness of the deities. In the ancient times, they would do rituals to ward off dark spirits, to prevent the carnivores of their time being able to get to them and such. And this concept of doing something physically, and somehow that physical action is going to convey spiritual warfare, is fascinating, and it's fun to replicate. And in many cases, the gods become almost the playthings of the storyteller, because he's utilizing them to invoke action by the players. Now, because the clerics and the paladins of early Dungeons and Dragons could invoke those names, there were even artifacts and powerful devices that were described in the rules that were associated with those beings. For example, the Wand of Orcus, the concept that you have a device that was handled by one of the greater demons, arguably therefore the counteraction to the gods, if you follow kind of a Miltonian pathway. But these items were conveyed with the powers that the priesthood, if you would, of the day might have been able to claim in its earliest iterations. Now, when you try to bring that into a monotheistic system, or try to establish a singular God created above all of the others, and that the others are mere shadows, it adds credence to the clerical pathway, because you are invoking the power of the actual God, if you will, and therefore the magics that are possible can be truly miraculous. The idea that the raising of the dead, or a resurrection of the spirit, those are things that are, the tales, the tropes and the tales of ancient books, whether that be the traditional Western Bible, or even earlier versions of tomes that represented the powers from beyond that. One of my favorite films is The Name of the Rose, and in that tale, Umberto Eco talks about these ancient awarenesses that were established in written form, and therefore could be discoverable by a mortal simply by reading these books. And Dungeons and Dragons kind of takes that kind of attack towards it, that all of the various forms of the gods and arguably their descendants, the demigods, or those that dared to ascend to that level of deity, are fundamentally operating within a framework that is defined and does not take into account any true understanding of a singular creator. It creates a nice muddy place to operate. Fiction writers throughout history have dabbled in their own right with the concept of the gods. You see it certainly in the description of the Order of Seven in Game of Thrones and that kind of ilk, where the recreation is made as an almost as a external template, and that the person who is storyteller then is manipulating that group almost the way you might a group of cultists in, say, a Lovecraftian story, that we don't know really where their power comes from, but they do their rituals and magical things occur, and therefore it is real to the story. And most game masters of my era, and there probably aren't many of us left, but the game masters from the older period certainly wouldn't have considered or undertaken to place their players on a path towards the achievement of that established level of deity. It was simply unattainable. And the argument about whether or not you could kill the gods or whatever was made tangible in Gods, Demigods, and Heroes, later called Legends and Lore, to avoid confrontation with those who were religious. But in either manifestation, the books still gave, numeric values to the gods that were of these different faiths. They were careful not to actually attack the ones that were in practical application of the time, nor do they do so now that I know of. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't believe they actually cover Yeshua or Jehovah or Yahweh in any tangible numeric way. Although I think they did at one point list the apostles and their various abilities, but those wouldn't be much more than classic high-level NPCs. But the use of the deities changed over time as players moved forward in the chronology of, for example, the world of Kryn. There was a tangible pantheon created, and again, were nominally used as conversant NPCs. You could definitely ask a boon or a curse of them, depending on their philosophic bent, but they were just a structure for that interaction. And it wasn't until we get much later when we start talking about Asirarak and the death spell, that the spell scourge that started wiping out deity. But that, I think, really, if you look at it, is metaphoric, because the concept of the deconstruction of religiosity in America certainly does lend itself back to the concept of the death of God in actual philosophy. As the world progressed towards postmodernism and the realization that there is error in just about every logical path, there are errors in consciousness because we are individual beings. That manifests, if you will, in the game by the deconstruction of the clergy, the disconnection between the concept of a cleric and the deity to which they serve, and fundamentally relegating them really to a, I guess you'd argue, alternate morality of the warlock, the idea of a person who gains their magic by a specific pact with a specific being who provides them power in trade for either their soul or certain sacrifices and such. This softening of the line between deity and humanity has, it's not problematic in most cases, but it's also difficult to try to arbitrarily carry forward. Now, in the world of Nikos, for example, in my game sessions, deities were never really assailable. If you were a clergy, you could argue against the clergy of another faith, but you couldn't actually engage in competition or even conflict with the other deities in a one-on-one basis. You weren't actually fighting and throwing down actual gods. Mainly because I was, as a Christian, challenged by that very idea. Certainly, people can have philosophical courses that take them into error, which leads to the variety of the different gods that are described and whatnot, but they are not actually established as assailable, a force that you can reckon with. So in the world of Nikos, for example, the gods became namesakes. Yes, the power came from good, but whether you were a follower of Pelor or a follower of Zeus or of Poseidon, that was a personal choice and had nothing to do with actual forces of good and evil. Which meant players could still follow courses that took them down very materialistic pathways. You know, the idea of the adventuring group going after the loot of the dragon just to have the loot of the dragon. Cool. They went and grabbed all the gold. Good for them. But there was no, and even in the places where there were required, quote, sacrifice, it was always done in terms of economics. You gained a certain amount of loot, you were expected to give away a portion of it to the destitute, or in a broader sense to the order, the religious order, who's then were tasked with taking care of the peasants and the poor. But again, the concept of fantasy takes you so far afield from those very discussions that they become, you know, the conversational points in the after action reports and the debriefings of the games rather than the games themselves. Matter of fact, some of the deepest conversations that players had about morality had nothing to do with those at all. As a matter of fact, the very structure of the Dungeons and Dragons, pardon me, the alignment chart, the alignment grid, with the lawful's opposite of the chaos and the good opposite the evil, and the differentiation of the variances between them, became, if you will, for roleplay games, the god. That's what you were following, is that adherence to those policies. And the irony is that they turned indirectly the tolerance and goodness of a paladin under the classic definition of a lawful good paladin into the most stringent and almost imprisonment style relationship with the deities, that if you weren't lawful enough and good enough, then you were not ascending to the highest levels within those orders, really undermined the very basis of the grid. And it didn't take, probably about half of my game mastering life, 25 years, that's a long time, where I utilized that grid and focused on it. But the second half I moved further and further from it because it seemed to make less and less sense. Now, conversely, the very concept of characters reaching Paragon level, for most players of Dungeons and Dragons, the accomplishment of reaching that maximum level and achieving your final modifier or whatever at, say, 20th level was the goal. That was what you were playing for. Many campaigns ended at that point. And still, there were those who wanted to push beyond that boundary and start to manipulate the boundaries between the created and the creators, and put their pantheon champions up against the demigods, and perhaps even against the lesser gods, in an attempt to elevate themselves. And while in a lot of cases this was fundamentally a form of hubris, they just simply wanted to puff themselves up to that point. Nonetheless, there's good quality adventuring to be done in those realms if you are of a more philosophic nature and more dealing with it from the standpoint of ideology than actually engaging with it in any kind of real terms. On the other hand, of course, who wouldn't, if you have stats on anything, there's somebody who wants to overcome that being using those rules. And that in some ways, the very concept of the gods became so scalar in nature. In other words, as new product came along, it was very much the power creep that you might expect in any advancing game system, that there's always got to be another step, another way, another advancement, another progression pathway that we can follow, so that the very statistics of the Legends and Lore book, the Gods, Demigods, and Heroes books, become old hat. I've now reached a point where my persona has enough hit points that I could go up against a god, and based on the god's self-proclaimed regeneration numbers, all we have to do is figure out a weapon that can do destruction above that level. And now the gods are literally just more stepping stones. And I believe that's why you end up with monsters like the Tarask being developed in later eras of Dungeons and Dragons. The concept of a being that is insurmountable, or seems to be, but of course then, like I said, if you put attributes to it, it becomes something that to be taken down as well. But when you do this, when you have characters that achieve Paragon status, they have achieved the maximum level within the game, there's really no place for them to continue to roleplay unless the game master now wants to be a world builder and wants to build the mechanisms for climbing, ascending beyond the gods. And while there are a few, I suppose, that dabble in that kind of creative level where you are reconsidering the paradigm in another way, generally the rules just simply whitewashed the gods right out of the game. They took the cleric in a different direction. They made it more about the mechanisms of their faith than it did about their actual belief in their faith. And again, to juxtapose, in the Nikos ideology, instead, those forces of the gods, the concept of being the helper, the healer, the being of the very essence of life, conveyed or translated to the avatar. And in that way, I was able to provide for the legacy player a way to continue in the realms even when they were not playing, and still have something to hang their hat on, to still hear their characters' names regaled in the adventures, and the interactions of players with those now perfected avatars really gave a new kind of spur to the storyline. As a matter of fact, I think it was in the early 80s that I determined that if there were gods indeed, the players could choose to worship any that they wished, but the worship was not the same as the advocation of power. And so at around fourth level, just when the character was starting to gain its first set of faith-based benefits from their position in the clergy, I afforded them the opportunity to interact with the avatars, and the avatars would actually choose the players. So you were not choosing your gods, but rather your gods were choosing you. And I felt that this better represented the concept of the demigod, the idea of the hero that's been chosen to do a specific boon for the gods, and in trade gains that relevance in future iterations and future realms. It was when I started running actually the third iteration that it finally dawned on me that, hey, we're going to be building a legacy of the story, so therefore the persona of previous adventures who served the purpose well and played their role identifiably should be able to become established as the guides for the persona moving forward. And so, yes, you could certainly have role play the belief in, for example, Crom or Helios or whatever. You could definitely claim that those are the source of your power, but the source of your real power actually has to choose you. And this was in the before the injunction was defined, before there was the understanding that the characters were a living thing and they existed without the player being there, really developed from the idea of the avatar as the pinnacle, that a player character, if they did their job right and they finished their adventure and they reached that highest level, then they became the advisors fundamentally. I think I was probably influenced, at least at some level, by the concepts that we see in Star Wars, that as Yoda leaves the real world, he enters a realm where he's still perceptible to those that believe in him or have a faith in his same culture, and therefore he has agency beyond the grave to act to support the others in their decisions. I think I think Star Wars relegates it to becoming one with the Force, and now having an identity that's recognizable as such in the afterworld is really a nod to the power of that person's identity. And so the people who play through and become paragons in the iteration campaign for 7-year period become the advisors, guides, and supports in that new higher realm in later iterations. And that is maintained as long as the story is able to maintain the relevance of that being. In other words, as long as there is a memory that, oh yeah, there was a Klondike Stormfist, then Klondike Stormfist can influence the story. But once that persona's relevance has been lost chronologically, when you're far enough down the road, then those avatars recede from interaction and are no longer pushing the agenda, but rather the beings of the later iteration who also performed well take on those roles. And so in the 7th iteration, for example, the persona all agreed that they were going to erase themselves from the story and instead invoke beings known as the spirits of the Veils, or the Order of the Veils sources. And so Carolus and Ribera and such, even if they had a persona that had played, like for example Robin of the Red Band, a absolutely typical clergyman and warrior, eventually becomes Rubera, the spirit behind the Order of Red Veil. A manifestation is not held. In other words, Rubera is feminine, whereas Robin of the Red Band was masculine. That did not carry over because the very concept of being of control or in control still is manifested in the latter rather than in the former. So now the players can interact with the avatars of the veils, and arguably that can be maintained iteration over iteration merely because the champions of each iteration choose to not follow that path. So when we look at modern times, however, you now have a situation where the players who have been playing long enough to know the old system as well as the new system have chosen intentionally to take the path towards deity. So, for example, Cord, Lord, Torg, Lord of Cord, becomes the god of the woodlands, Torg, because of his Cord, as he wanted to carry that forward. Now the irony is that Cord had been a follower of Cord, according to the older definition of who Cord was, but the modern iteration has fundamentally erased the older Cord, and so Cord is the Golian, if you will, god of the woodlands. Whereas in the case of Miri of the Green Veil, who became the representative of the rainbow, her pathway was very deliberate. She specifically worked to maintain her storyline into the 8th and 9th iterations, focusing on becoming deity. And it's almost like we've gone full circle. We're now back to where there are gods of Nikos, but that merely has been if you will, that has been benefited by the very processes that keep the realms of Nikos out of the clutches, if you will, of the Dungeons and Dragons alignment grid and such. Well, I have reached my half an hour, and I don't want to put you through a commercial if I can help it. I don't know, I may have been a bit too long, but we are going to go ahead and call this episode. When this is cut down to size, of course, it'll be within the 30 minutes on YouTube. If you haven't yet and you are watching, you definitely want to subscribe to the Twitch channel, because subscription means no more commercials. If you subscribe, commercials are made irrelevant to you, and you can watch the show with impunity. If you are on YouTube, we definitely would ask you to subscribe, because it really helps us reach a larger audience and creates a better community for us all. In the meantime, if you like this video, I would highly recommend that you check out my Game Masters Academy series. It's one of the playlists on our Yu-Gi-Oh site, and Yu-Gi-Oh. Wow, there's a slip. Yes, I was the marketing director for Gamma and the tournament sort of liaison for a Yu-Gi-Oh brand, but I don't know how that slipped through. That's going to be another place we're going to have to make a cut and splice. So if you are watching this on YouTube, please subscribe, because it really helps us to build our community and reach out to others. And if you get the opportunity, make sure you watch our Game Mastery Academy series, because it really helps storytellers and directors and game masters like yourself become better and more proficient at the skills that it takes to do this, for me, lifetime task. Until such time as I see you next time, we are on 10 a.m. each morning, Monday through Friday, and 11 p.m. Both those are in Pacific times, and I hope to see you in the next episode. Talk to you soon.